Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, welcome to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. This is a joint venture by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, India. I am Lisa and I am here to present a series of lectures, video lectures on the subject or on the area of study known as cultural studies. I've been with you for the past almost 17 lectures, and if you've been following at least a few of them, you would be aware by now that we have already covered the introductory part relating to the basic premises of cultural studies. We have looked at a few theories like Marxism, structuralism. We are now in module 2. In fact, we are in towards the end of the second module, where we discuss the certain key concepts, and as I had mentioned earlier, these are the key concepts being discussed are by no means the only key concepts, that is, the list is not an exhaustive one. However, we have talked about what I feel are the most important ones, at least at this elementary level. The key concepts being, for instance, subjectivity, identity, ideology, representation, power, etc. I need to remind the viewers again that these lectures that are being brought to you are for the engineering students in various colleges in India, and humanities being a part of the IIT system. The subjects, the disciplines being taught are taught with a certain view, with a view to acquainting the engineering students to certain areas and disciplines in the humanities and social sciences. To many, especially research scholars in the humanities, some of our lectures may seem to be elementary, but I believe that however elementary, lectures in the humanities and social sciences being brought to you would help you revise your elementary concepts. So, we are today in the 18th lecture, and the lecture is on the key concept discourse. We will first do a recap of the last lecture, which you are aware was on power, and then we shall go on to talk about discourse. We saw in the last lecture that power is an important concept, okay, is an important it's part of the terminology, the core terminology, so to speak, of cultural studies, and culture is seen as a language, it is seen as a tool. Culture is also artifacts, it is a way of life, and culture is also sometimes synonymous with power. We then went on to consider two quotations or two articulations, so to speak, on power, connecting it to the concept, the key concept that we had discussed in the lecture before the lecture on power, and These were by Larry Gross, for instance, representation in the mediated reality of our mass culture is in itself power. Second, representation functions more like the model of a dialogue, this is by Stuart Hall, and attempting to fix meanings is exactly why power intervenes in discourse. Now, I need to remind the viewers once again that the methodology being followed in my lectures, in these series of lectures being delivered, is that I bring to you the key articulations, as far as possible, the key articulations made by several critics and scholars in the field of cultural studies. We look at those articulations, and my attempt is always to try and unpack the formulations that have been made to really make this a virtual classroom, in the sense that I try and speak to you as I would speak to my students in the class. So, what we do here is we read several quotations, passages from important critics like, as you know, Chris Barker is an important figure here, Stuart Hall, and several theorists whose work contribute to the development of cultural studies. Now, let us look at the next slide. The other point that we also we had discussed is that power and freedom are to be seen as two areas in which there are no fixities, there are instead negotiations, and displacement of boundaries. In cultural studies, both these terms are fluid, both these terms are flexible, and the point here is that it is important to see these terms as not being fixed, as being fluid and capable of change. Next, we also looked at in the last lecture on Adorno and Horkheimer's articulation on power through technological rationality, and technological rationality leads to what they call the rationality of domination. So, power, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, we may summarize them as saying that power is akin to the rationality that is provided by technology. It is a kind of rationality that is instrumental in nature, instrumental in function, and perhaps a purpose. This rationality, which is the rationality of domination, is how power operates in society. Next, we reminded ourselves that cultural studies, being an area of study, being a discipline which questions, whose main whose chief aim is not just to elucidate certain terms, not just to explain certain cultural practices, but to question those very practices, those very forms. In that, we may say here that power relations always need analysis, elaboration, and questioning. This is a political task for us. Then we are coming close to the key concept of our lecture today, and we will move to it by first referring to its relation or relationship with power. Discourse creates power, and discourse creates power by invoking truth, by trying to fix meanings, by trying to establish practices, and by trying to determine morality. This is how discourse is related to power, and today we need to look closely at this term discourse. Discourse is a term, and it kindred terms like discursive practices, episteme, etc. These are terms that are found difficult by some students even in certain higher levels, and let us see how we can unpack this term for you. Fine. So, discourse is the topic of discussion today. Now, we will first look at the formulations given by Chris Barker. First, let me read the first paragraph. Referring to discourse, Barker says, discourse, the routine day-to-day usage of the term discourse simply refers to a stretch of text or spoken utterances that cohere into a meaningful exposition. Okay? This is what we may call is the commonsensical understanding of discourse. For instance, what do? When we talk about language, we will say that first we have letters. Okay? Letters combine to give rise to words. Words combine to give rise to sentences, and sentences combine to give rise to discourse. Okay? This is a typical way in which we look at, we consider discourse, that is, discourse is a stretch of text, as Barker tells us, a stretch of text or of spoken utterances that cohere into a meaningful exposition. It is enough for discourse to in a coherent manner to create meaning for us. However, let us look at this. Cultural studies practitioners are more often than not using the concept of discourse in a more technical way. Therefore, there is a difference in how we use the term discourse in a commonsensical way and as a technical term in cultural studies. So, however, cultural studies practitioners are more often than not using the concept of discourse in a more technical way. Now, here discourse is said to unite language and practice. Discourse is not simply a matter of joining letters and to form words, to form sentences, to form paragraphs, and to form finally a coherent meaning in a discourse. Okay? Here, as in so many formulations in cultural studies, here also language and practice are said to be united in a discourse. Okay? Discourse is said to unite language and practice, and therefore, we may define discourse as regulated ways of speaking about something. This is to me a brief way of defining discourse, but something that captures the essence, okay, through particularly the word regulated. Discourse refers to regulated ways, almost as monitored ways of speaking about a subject, as if you cannot speak outside of the rules, regulations and norms of speaking about something. So, discourse unites language and practice, and discourse is the regulated way of speaking about a subject. And how is it related to practice? Okay? Through these regulated ways of speaking about something, about X, any subject or event, okay? Through these ways of regulated ways of speaking, objects and practices through reiteration, okay, begin to acquire meaning. Okay. At extremes, the meanings are sought to be frozen, sought to be quote unquote naturalized, right. So, that we feel that there is just this way of looking at any phenomenon, any object, any cultural practice and none else. Then Barker says the production of knowledge through language that gives meaning to material objects and social practices we may call discursive practice. Okay? So, discursive practices are what? Discursive practices simply refer to the production of knowledge through language, and through language finally through repeated practice, that is something that gives meaning to both material objects and social practices, and it is through discursive practices that meanings are finally established, or rather through the practice of our discourses. Now, I will give you an example here. I may have referred to it in one of my earlier lectures where I talked briefly about discourse. Now, if discourse is a regulated way of speaking about anything, about I said any phenomenon, any subject, etc., let us look at the term man. Okay? The term man now can be discursively, discursively articulated, okay, in different ways. Now, let us look at this. A, from the point of view of religion, the discourse or regulated way of talking about man would differ from the way man is discursively created, okay, created in science, further different as we look at man as a discursive category from the point of view of psychiatry, further again different in law, and finally, but not the least, in subjects like economics, etc. Okay, this is of course not an exhaustive list, but the point I would like to make here is that anything, any subject, any object, any practice can be articulated in different ways. The rules will be different, the regulations would be different. This is the first meaning of discourse that we will have to understand, to internalize. Discourse with power, okay, or discourse, of course, now you see the word here in brackets, knowledge. Discourse is a word whose within cultural studies whose synonym is knowledge. Why? Because discourse is a way of talking about something. Discourse ultimately through repetition and reiteration goes on to become knowledge. At least certain discourses go on to become knowledge. Now, when these discourses become knowledge, they are also power. Why? Because they have, through a certain legitimization, they have they have a power not just as discourse, okay, but that is the power that discourse has over everyone, over everything, but also as the power that we feel that is knowledge. Okay. So, discourse as knowledge is related to power and is power. So, what happens is when discourse becomes knowledge, established discourse, okay, it creates and controls us as subjects. For instance, if you talk about man, as we saw in in this example I had given just a while ago, if we look at religion, for instance, there would be certain formulations, okay, certain ways of talking about man that both creates the subject man. In religion, man is a certain kind of subject. Okay. There are associated within the discursive practice and discursive articulation of man, for instance. You cannot talk about man from any other perspective. If you do talk about man from another domain, from another discourse, that discourse has to sort of so to speak fall in line with the dominant discourse, that is in this case the discourse of man within religion. That is why we say that discourse and discourse as knowledge, knowledge as power create and control us as subjects. Look at this, it both it first creates the subject and then it controls the subject. Further, the subject, therefore, in this case, if you have understood the slide before this, okay, the subject, and where we say that the subject is created first and then controlled by discourse, the subject therefore is the effect, okay. The subject is the effect of discourse, the subject is the effect of talking in a certain way about that particular subject. Okay. Therefore, the subject is a matter, this is this is the articulation, or this is the claim made by cultural studies, particularly following the linguistic turn. Okay? The subject is therefore, as an effect of discourse, is a matter of language, and it is a matter of practice. Okay, we will talk as we go on in this lecture. This will become more and more, more and more evident to you. Discourse therefore may also be seen as the power to name, okay, the ability to create a subject. Just a while ago, we talked about the discourse of religion, for instance. Okay, now how would religion then name man? Here naming is not simply a matter of labels. Okay, here naming means how to fix within the discourse, how to fix the category man such that you can create the idea of, or you have the ability to create the idea of man that is not given elsewhere, right. For instance, if we talked about man, again let us say from this point of view of as articulated in a religious discourse, okay, we will create the subject, or we would create the category, we would name the category, we would make formulations on the category man by saying, for instance, within a certain discourse that man is already a fallen entity, okay, or that man is something, okay, man is something that as a subject comes to this world to atone, or to make amends for his sins, or for instance, or to serve a certain entity known as God. Okay, so it therefore names the subject as having these particular qualities, as having these particular characteristics. Okay, so discourse is then, you may say, discourse is something that is extremely powerful, right, and the idea therefore is not, I would say, to fall a prey to any kind of discourse, to understand that regulate, the moment you use the word regulation, the moment we talk about discourse as having the ability, the power to name, the ability to create subjects, we also can know that it is possible for us to escape discourse. However, a note of caution here, this doesn't mean a kind of an opportunistic discourse hopping from one discourse to the other. Okay, for instance, if you ask me as a scholar of cultural studies, then I would largely look at the world from the point of view of the discourse of historical materialism, of dialectical materialism, as given to us by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So everyone eventually comes and rests within certain discourses. Therefore, how do we relate discourse to culture? If culture is maps of meaning, okay, if culture refers to maps of meaning, and these, we have to understand that these maps are, and this is something we had discussed earlier also, I would like to talk about it again for a brief while. We should realize that the maps of meaning are temporary formulations. This is what Hall had said, Stuart Hall had said. Remember that these maps of meaning are always changing and they have to change and they need to be questioned, right. So, these maps of meaning, whenever they attain certain stability, whenever whenever we feel like saying that this is the natural way that things are in, that this is the way that things should be, we have to then remember, if you look at the slide here, that it is only a temporary stability. These maps, okay, they are just temporary stabilizations of meaning, and these temporary stabilizations of meaning are brought forth by the discursive practices of the time. Okay. So, every epoch, every era, as Michel Foucault would say, every epoch is governed by a certain discourse, governed by a certain episteme or a unit of knowledge. Okay. It is very important for us to understand that meaning, whenever meaning is stabilize or we find that meaning is being stabilized, we have to caution ourselves and have to look at it as formations that have been made, temporary civilizations that have been made owing to certain discursive practices which are the dominant discursive practices of this time. It is important to talk about this. One may feel that we are, as many would say, that we are always political. Let me remind you, or let us remind ourselves that the whole business of doing cultural studies is, or at least a large part, a major part of the business of doing cultural studies is to destabilize meaning, is to be political. Therefore, these are some of the terms that we should look at. Discursive practice is something that we have already talked about. Episteme, finally leading to epistemology. Episteme is a unit of knowledge, okay? A unit of knowledge which leads to knowledge formation. Discursive formations are also therefore discursive practices that finally, congeal to give rise to a certain formation of discourse. Okay, these practices establish a certain and create a certain formation which is a discursive formation and regimes of truth. Okay, remember these seemingly permanent, stabilization of meaning, which is actually a temporary one, as Stuart Hall has shown us. They try to establish regimes of truth. Now, in this slide, if you look at this slide here, episteme, a certain episteme, okay, through the discursive practices and formations, right, give rise to or seek to establish at least a regime of truth in every epoch. Okay. So, these are kindred terms, these are terms related, that I said, to discourse, episteme, discursive practice, discursive formation and regimes of truth. As with the circuit of culture, remember in our lecture on representation we found that Stuart Hall had given us the circuit of culture, wherein he said that words like representation, words like ideology, etc., are not studied in isolation. We are studying their negotiations, their interweavings, their interrelations, the interstices, so to speak, between these areas and their interfaces. Okay. In the same way here, when we talk about discourse, when we talk about knowledge and we talk about power, we have to understand that we cannot study discourse separately, knowledge separately, or power separately. We have to study these as being in a circuit. Okay. So, if discourse is a circuit, like Stuart Hall had shown us culture as a circuit, if discourse is a circuit, there are certain terms in circulation, and within the discourse of discourse, okay, within the discourse of discourse, there are certain terminology, there are certain terms that we have to get used to if we have to speak in a certain way. So, well, one of the criticisms of discourse may well be this, that even the talking about discourse, there is a regulated way in which you speak about discourse itself, that the speaking of discourse is a discourse, and within this regulated way of speaking, you have to use terms like power, like knowledge, like discursive formation and regimes of truth. Now, I would like to quote from Michel Foucault in a bid to see how he has, of course, he has talked about discourse on so many occasions. It is not, we need a separate lecture on Foucault and discourse, but I will bring here just a very few lines from Foucault and try and unpack these for you. Let us read here. This is Foucault. My role, and that is too emphatic a word, is to show people that they are much freer than they feel, that people accept truth as evidence, some themes. Okay? People accept truth as evidence, some themes which have been built up at a certain moment during history. This is also what I referred to just a while ago. Okay? We are saying this through Foucault's words, right? People accept as truth certain themes which he says were built up, and look at his words here, at a certain moment during history, right. These themes are we could also use the word episteme for these. Okay. These themes or these episteme are seen as truth by people, whereas the fact is, the reality is that these have been, as he says, built up at a certain moment during history. And then we read on here, and that this so called evidence, this is important, can be criticized and destroyed. This seemingly eternal truth that eternal truths that all of us feel we have at particular moments of history, at particular discursive epochs, if you will, okay, is something that Foucault shows that these are creations and formations that depend on the particular epoch in which they were made, and in turn also determine the character of that particular epoch. Okay. And this so called evidence, look at the words he uses here, this so called evidence is something that has to be criticized, something that has to be destroyed. Okay. Next, thought does exist both beyond and underneath systems and edifices of discourse. It is something that is often hidden, but always drives everyday behaviors. Criticism consists in uncovering that thought and trying to change it, showing that things are not as obvious as people believe, making it so that what is taken for granted is no longer taken for granted. I mean, this is what else is this if it is not being political, okay? If it is not being doing what cultural studies cultural studies invokes us or impels us to do. Okay? Criticism consists, it says, in uncovering that thought, right, in uncovering the systems of discourse and trying to change it, and to show, okay, to show us as consumers of discourse that things are not always as obvious as people believe, making it so that what is taken for granted is no longer taken for granted. So, this is the way he puts it so beautifully. To practice criticism is to make harder those acts which are now too easy for us. Okay? So, the whole business of cultural criticism is to, you may use the word, is to defamiliarize the familiar ways of, familiar regulated ways of talking about things. Next, Foucault, we will refer here to his famous, within this whole the whole business of talking about discourse, we refer to a famous phrase called the death of the author, and this is a phrase that has been so misunderstood. There are various ways in which people have interpreted and misinterpreted interpreted this this phrase, and we will now try to understand how this phrase holds meaning in the whole in the domain of cultural studies. Now, let us look carefully at this. Foucault: a work is definitely not the form of expression of a particular individuality. Okay? The death of the author means precisely this, that there is no there is no discourse or language that belongs to one particular author. When an author writes, the author writes from within a discourse. The author is already ensconced, so to speak, okay, ensconced in the in the whole format, in the whole content of the discourse, in the style of the discourse. In that sense, the author is dead. That is the talking about the death of the singularity of the author. It is not, it does not say that the author is not giving a message, that the author has nothing to say, that it is the text which is speaking. We need to be a little on guard here and to understand that what Foucault and the post-structuralists are saying is that the discourse is already there from where within one speaks. Okay? It is not, or it does not mean that there is no message, that there is no beautiful moral, for instance, a formulation that has been given by the author. There is no beautiful way of talking about certain themes. It does not mean that, it simply means that the discourse is already there, and hence the author and his or her singularity in that sense of the term disappears, or as it says here, dies. A work, now let us look at it again, a work is definitely not the form of expression of a particular individuality. The work always implies, as it were, the death of the author. One only writes in order to disappear at the same time. The work, in a way, exists on its own as the bare and, look at this, anonymous flow of language. This is important. The paradox here is, even as a person with a name, with a face is speaking, who is certainly not anonymous, who is certainly somebody who could be identified. The paradox here is that as that person is writing, okay, his or her work exists as the anonymous flow of language. The importance given here, the power given here is obviously to language and to discourse and to the text. Okay. The work is composed of certain relations within language itself. It is a particular structure, look at this, it is a particular structure in the world of language, discourse and literature. And I must hasten to add here is that we would have to understand the death of the author within this kind of a discourse. Okay, this too is a discourse. Talking about the death of the author is, it too is a discourse. But how is it different from talking about other things regarding the author? Okay, in this case, we are doing what we may call a meta linguistic or a meta thinking exercise. Okay, this is language thinking about itself. Okay, this is language thinking about writing. And this, and in this sense, the phrase the death of the author is to be understood. It in literary studies, it certainly it would be a very extreme way of looking at this formulation. If you look at it simply as something meaning that the author does not exist and the author has not written this text and the author is nobody in time and space, certainly we don't accept such a myopic view of looking at an author or at a writer. But at the same time, okay, the business of looking at discourse is also the business of trying to say that the language, he says, the language, the world of language, discourse and literature is already available. And in many ways, an author is bound by certain ways of speaking, certain discursive formations, certain formulations, however much he or she may improvise or be radical. Now, I will look at, I have also brought in David Howarth's book Discourse, and let us look at what he has to say. Talking about discourse, how it says that its growing prominence is not only evident in the increasing number of studies which use the concepts and methods of discourse analysis, but also visible in the widening scope of its deployment. Discourse analysis is not something you get in cultural studies per se. Okay, discourse analysis is to do, broadly speaking, with the study of language, with the study of writing, of articulation. Howard says that something that was talked about discourse and discourse analysis. Remember, we had said that in language we may talk about, of course, in a very simplistic way. We talk about discourse as something that is a discourse is a joining together of several paragraphs, which has to make sense, which has to have as as mentioned earlier, it has to cohere together in a united sort of way to in unity in order to be able to make some meaning. Okay. So, such analysis of discourse is carried out in the study of language, in the study of literary texts, and there have been very fruitful exercises in this. But Howard says that there is, as it says, a widening of the course of even the deployment of the word discourse and even of discourse analysis. Scholars in academic disciplines as diverse as anthropology, history and sociology, psychoanalysis and social psychology, culture, gender and postcolonial studies, political science, public policy analysis, political theory and international relations, not to mention linguistics and literary theory, have used the concept of discourse to define and explain problems in their respective fields of study. Okay? So, it is not that discourse is a word which is sort of peculiar to cultural studies. Okay? The awareness of the power of discourse, okay, as knowledge, is something that has struck the minds of scholars across so many disciplines. Okay? And there is an awareness, there is, you could say, even within disciplines there is a self awareness of the fact that each discipline is talking in regulated ways, which have been set, which have been set by somebody else, say set in the past, right. So, there is already a format, as I had said earlier, a form and a content available. Okay. But how are how is cultural studies and the study of discourse in cultural studies different from the study of discourse in say linguistics, literary theory, postcolonial studies, etc. Okay. I would say that even if these discourses are talking about these disciplines are talking about discourse, okay, it is only with the linguistic turn, it is only with the the sharp paring away and the sharp look that has been given to discourse in cultural studies following the linguistic turn, that these other areas have been, so to speak, empowered, okay, to look at themselves and their own discourses. Okay. Secondly, the way discourse is analyzed, is dissected, is critiqued, and in the words of Foucault, so also destroyed in cultural studies is perhaps this is the most, what should I say, this is the most intense way, okay, the most intense way, the most the most important way of studying cultural studies. Okay. In a sustained manner, the way in which discourses are dismantled, discourses are first critiqued and then dismantled, is something which is definitely peculiar to cultural studies. Now, this is what Howard acknowledges here in the second paragraph here. This is a product of the belated impact of the so-called, this is what I mentioned just a while ago, the so-called linguistic turn on the social sciences and the consequent rise of new approaches such as hermeneutics, critical theory and pro-structuralism following in its wake. Therefore, to summarize what Howard says, there is a wide scope and there is an increase in there is a widening, perhaps in contemporary times, a growing widening of the scope of discourse and of discourse analysis. Second, there is also the widening of the applicability, right. So much so that today we talk about the discourse of science, the discourse of technology, the discourse of computer science, the discourse of so many other of nanotechnology, for instance. It is in every new so to speak, every new discipline that establishes itself is you can apply the term discourse and find out its the way it has been constituted, the factors that have given rise to such a discourse at a certain time in space, in history, and what are how is that discourse delimited, and how is that discourse so to speak not forcing, but so to speak telling us how to talk in certain regulated and monitored ways, okay, and how these discourses have their own boundaries. Now, number 3, it is non-positivist, obviously, okay, since there is an element of the uncertainty of meaning. There is an element of the slipperiness, so to speak, of meaning, which is certainly not positivistic, certainly not quantifiable, measurable in certain ways in which we do science. And it has, number 4, it has given rise to new approaches in many fields. Then he says, finally, the emergence of a distinctive field of discourse analysis within the discipline of linguistics during the 1970s and its subsequent take-up by practitioners in disciplines such as cultural studies and literary theory have led to a novel or a new conception of discourse and a specific way of conducting discourse analysis. For some, discourse analysis is a very narrow enterprise that concentrates on a single utterance or at most a conversation between two people. Others see discourse as synonymous with the entire social system in which discourses literally, this is important, while we no longer talk about discourse as talking about utterances and their formations finally into paragraphs and discourses, where we can do an analysis of these in a linguistic sense. We see today, look at this here, we see discourse as synonymous with the entire social system, which is a huge thing to say, and which is one of the key, you could say, the key formulations in cultural studies. Okay? Discourse is equal to the social system. The social system itself is a discourse, and in social systems, discourses literally, okay, constitute the social and the political world. So, the social and the political world is definitely, no doubt, lived out by us. There are material practices, okay, but scholars in cultural studies claim that these material practices are simply not about matter. They are also, or more importantly, a matter of language, okay, or a matter of discourse. He then will end with this. Discourses, therefore, are also cognitive schemata, in the sense that discourses are now embedded, okay, ways of thinking are so embedded in our minds, in our brains, even in our neural structures perhaps, okay, that they become schemas, or they become, established patterns or ways of thinking in a cognitive sense. Our perceptions, right, and even our memories, the way we give the way we give attention to things, right, these are ultimately decided by discourse. Discourses finally become cognitive schemata. Second, discourses are also instrumental devices. How? They are instrumental devices because they can tell us how to speak, they can tell us what to speak, and they can also determine our cultural practices. Okay? They have a certain ontological realism about that. It is almost paradoxical that we are talking about ontology, where we have always talked about non-ontology or non-ontological things, but discourses have the power of being real. It is in this sense. Okay? Discourses have the power of telling us what, the essential things about things. However temporary these civilizations of meaning may be, but they do have the power of ontology, they do have the power of giving us, giving essences to things and phenomena. Finally, discourses have causal powers. Okay? These are the ways in which discourse is power. Therefore, discourses, and we end with this, are objects, they are structured systems, they are ideological systems, and they are texts. So, we now go on to the discussion and we will look at a few questions. For instance, in cultural studies the term discourse means more than a stretch of text. Elaborate. Now, how are you going to deal with a question like this? You would then invoke Barker in saying that, well, Barker says that in for many discourses are nothing but stretches of text or spoken utterances, but discourse is more than that in the sense that, here look here, discourse is said to unite language and practice. It is not a matter only of speech or of writing. Okay? Discourse unites language and it unites our practices and refers to, this is very important as I had mentioned before, regulated ways of speaking through which we can even create the subjectivity of a particular phenomenon. Okay? Next, what are the various ways in which we may consider the term discourse? The various ways in which we may consider the term discourse are objects. Discourses are objects. Discourses are structured systems. They are ideological systems, and discourses are of course texts. Explain the concept of the death of the author. The death of the author, through Foucault we can explain this as not meaning that there is no author and that not that somebody didn't ever write. It simply means that the discourse is already, as I said, always already available to somebody, so much so that we can never perhaps talk about the singularity, the uniqueness as far as discourse use is concerned by a writer. Okay? However unique the writer's message may seem to be, however unique the form may seem to be, it is always tied to a way of speaking about, and all the improvisations that are made, okay, it is done within the format, so to speak, of a given discourse. Okay? So much so that we can say that, following the French poet Mallarmé said, when asked who is speaking, Mallarmé said language is speaking, and I think he fully understood the meaning of the death of the author. When he asked who is speaking, Mallarmé says language is speaking, not X or Y speaking, it is language. And as a poet he understood, okay, how he is writing, or we all write and speak within a discourse. So, this is all that we have to discuss as far as the word discourse is concerned, and I have tried to bring this to you through three persons, Chris Barker, David Howard and Michel Foucault, and obviously there are again so many, as always, so many critics that we can invoke in talking about discourse, but in order to bring to you both the meaning of discourse as in cultural studies, okay, vis-a-vis the meaning of discourse's utterance, in trying to show you the wide applicability of discourse and discourse analysis, in order to drive home to you the fact that discourse can even end up being cognitive schematas instantiated in our brains, okay, and in a bit to show you that even if we write, we are within writing and speaking from within a discourse, so much so that we have formulations like the death of the author. I hope I have we've been able to start grasping, able to start grappling with a difficult term like discourse. Thank you.